Let's get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of our peer learning and exchange event on the opportunities to integrate or to coordinate the integration of gender and climate change into budgeting and financing. For those joining us for the first time today, this event will be hosted in English, French, and Portuguese. You can choose your preferred language option on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. So before we get into the program for today, I just want to give us a quick recap of yesterday. So in session 1, we heard of the international frameworks, in particular the UNFCCC Gender Action Plan, which aims to build capacity and raise awareness of the financial and technical support for strengthening gender responsive climate budgeting. We also heard from the African Development Bank of initiatives under the African Union and the bank's alignment to this and how it is prioritizing gender and climate. It was clear from the presentations that gender inequality is a serious problem facing African governments, and the policy and legal frameworks have been put in place to prioritize gender equality, which is central to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Liberia, Burkina Faso, and Morocco all presented on the experience with gender responsive budgeting. These countries have shown impressive progress in this area, with experience spanning decades, as we saw in the case of Morocco, where reforms were gradually introduced over time. We also learned from the countries who have started to take a unified approach to gender and climate change. Pioneers in the area include Nigeria, who presented on the National Action Plan on Gender and Climate Change, clearly showing how that is linked to the International Gender Action Plan. Although we had poor connectivity, the Kingdom of Eswatini was able to share some insights with us on how they are integrating climate change into their new gender policy, while at the same time integrating gender into their nationally determined contributions. Finally, we had Rwanda, who shared more about their strategy on gender mainstreaming in environment and climate change, and how gender and climate change are included in budget formulation. Session 3 were group working sessions, and the facilitators kindly shared with me some key highlights from the discussions. In session 3A, the country experiences of Burkina Faso, Morocco, and Malawi were discussed. In particular, Mali made note of the development of the new national gender strategy in 2020, and countries highlighted key challenges such as issues about compliance and enforcement of reporting rules, particularly in Burkina Faso, and the gender and climate change tracking challenges as identified by Morocco. Session 3B focused on some of the countries' reforms in Cape Verde and Mozambique. In particular, Cape Verde with their gender expenditure tagging system, and Mozambique with their gender strategy and action plan. Session 3C focused more on the enabling conditions needed for gender responsive climate budgeting, such as the need for inclusive strategic planning with public participation and the need for political commitment at all levels of government. Finally, we had the session 3D, of which I was a part of, and we discussed the experience of Guinea, Nigeria, Mozambique, Rwanda, and Lesotho. The group identified the need to have clear focus on gender responsive climate budgeting from the national level through to local government level, and this is needed to be accompanied by strong capacity building and learning modules for all officials involved in the process. So I think one of the key challenges that came across in all the group discussions was the need for technical capacity when it comes to climate and gender mainstreaming, but also issues related to data limitations, in particular those in relation to disaggregated data based on gender and expenditure tracking. Finally, all groups also identified the need for clear political leadership. Thank you so much. So without further ado, let's get into our first session of the day, which is urgency of the problem. And I'm going to be joined by Adeneki Oladosu, please. Adeneki? And if Flo could please put the slides up.
Yeah, good morning from Nigeria.
So good morning, Adeneki. I'm so pleased to introduce Adeneki to everybody. Since 2018, she has been advocating for climate change adaptation and mitigation. In particular, she has been advocating for the restoration of the Lake Chad area. She is from Nigeria, and she has been an important youth African voice on gender and climate change at several international forums, including COP25. Welcome, Adeneki.
Thank you so much.
So, Adeneki, my first question for you is, please tell us how climate change has been impacting communities in the Lake Chad area. And as you answer this question, I'm just going to ask Flo to put the first slide up, please, which shows the picture of the Lake Chad area. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm pleased to be here as well to share my activism thus far on the Lake Chad region, because I know it's a key region in Africa that needs our attention and global attention at the same time to see how we can recharge or restore Lake Chad. So back to your question. I'm from Nigeria, and Lake Chad region is part of, it cut across Nigeria, Niger, Cameroon, Chad, and other Central African countries. And over time, we have been seeing this issue of insecurity, armed banditry, Boko Haram, and this makes our border to be porous, because when people lost their primary livelihoods and there are no ready alternatives, then it makes them to be prone to all of these crises. And I'll give an instance that happened back then. That was when I was in year 2, an undergraduate student in Nigeria. So that was when I saw this outbreak of Bring Back Our Girls, that is the Chibok school girls. Then I was researching, I saw that it happened in Borno, and Borno state is one of the states that is closer to this shrinking Lake Chad. So it makes the border to be porous to all of these insecurity threats, because I saw that they adopted some schoolgirls, about 76 schoolgirls were adopted. And in Yobe too, another set of schoolgirls were adopted. And these are the states that cut across the Lake Chad region that is being faced with drought, desertification. So this makes our border to be faced with different kinds of insecurity, because we are seeing it with food insecurity, we are seeing it with the displacement of people, we are also seeing it with the clashes between the herdsmen and the farmer, because these people in the northeastern part of Nigeria are moving to the north central, and it's increasing population at the same time, leading to limited natural resources that can cater for the rising population. And that is why you see the farmers and herdsmen, they are always clashing, because they have things that intercept them. They need a vegetative cover for their cattle to graze, and that is why they are migrating, because before now, migration is a strategy for adaptation. But right now, it is no longer a strategy. It has failed, because in the process of them moving to another state for greener pasture, they get to experience conflicts. And this conflict affects both the farmers and herdsmen, because they can't drive their cattle around like usual as it is being done. And at the same time, the farmers cannot access their farmland. So this is leading to religious division within religion and within ethnic group, and even it's even influencing the political part of it. And little percentage of the people are seeing it as a climate-induced factors. So these are the security threats that we are seeing, and it's also affecting our well-being as well. So and that is why I keep campaigning for the restoration of Lake Chad, because it is part of the issue that we can use to overcome any security threats, because right now climate change is clearly a security threat to us. And it's also affecting our national security, as we are seeing it in the increase in banditry, kidnapping, because people doesn't have alternative livelihoods. And the alternative that they are seeking is really affecting our peace and security in our society today. Thank you.
Thank you, Adeneke, for sharing those very concerning insights from the Lake Chad region. And you've touched on it briefly already, but could you just tell us a little bit more about how women in particular are being affected?
Thank you so much. So in the Lake Chad region, those 10.7 million plus people that have been displaced, 2/3 of them are women. And why is it that women are bearing the impact of the climate change crisis? It's because their livelihood totally depends on natural resources. As we know, or maybe we have been seeing it, that women produce 60 to 80% of the world's food. So and yet women doesn't have land on their own or right to own a land to some certain extent, especially being faced by cultural barriers, social barriers, economic barriers too. And so all of these things makes women to be affected by the climate change crisis. And at the same time, when there's scarcity of water, they have to go to the nearest community or to the next community to look for sources of water or to fetch firewood or other sources of energy that they can use to cater for their household. And in the process, it's going to affect them economically, because that long hours that they used to cater around, they could have used it to have economic gain or use it to add knowledge to improve them. But rather they're using it to fetch water or to look for different amenities that will be needed for their household. And in the process, they can be kidnapped or they can be killed. And when we talk about the girls too, in the process of them trying to work for their family to survive, they can become school dropout, or in the process of trying to go distance to get water, they can also drop out because they might not be able to cope with their academic work. We have seen figures that talked about the fact that in Sahel region, more than 20 million child brides. And this happened due to the fact that when it is time of drought, I saw an analysis from UN that stated it that when it is drought time, that is when there is increase in child brides, because they are using them as a survival strategy for the family to stabilize. And underage children that should be in the school to be learning to become change makers, and sometimes they are being adopted, by kidnappers. And to some extent, it might be a point of no return. So we have to see women as change agents. So these are things that are affecting women and girls in our society today. That environmental issue now is now a social issue, economic issue, is now different issue that is affecting their well-being, enabling them to be able to contribute to economic growth. And if we could educate girls, or if we could give them the platform to have their voice, we'll see that there will be improvement, because they can become a scientist, they can become a solar inventor, they can do several things that will help to improve our generation, that could help to improve our climate, that could help to also improve the development of our countries. And that is why when we improve the status of women and girls in our society, definitely is going to help to bring development in our country as a whole. And that is why I call myself an ecofeminist. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Actually, you've really given me a new perspective and understanding of how it is exactly women and girls are being affected. I think what makes your work stand out is the link you make between violent outbreaks and climate change. And you've touched on this as well briefly, but do you want to tell us more about climate change and how this is impacting peace and stability in the region? And maybe if we can move to the next slide, because we found that there have been several recent articles that have highlighted these outbreaks in the news.
Okay, thank you so much. According to this article, there is just reported in Northeast Nigeria, conflict killed more than 300,000 children. And that is how it's affecting both male and female. But they all experience the climate change crisis on a different scale, you know. But also, I also saw an humanitarian report too, that was last month, that gave a report on the issue happening in Lake Chad region. It was disheartening because it's not improving at all. And we ought to see much improvement, because we call this decade a decade of action. What do we want to back it with? You know, so different kind of escalation of crisis that we are seeing today in the Lake Chad region. And one of these things that is happening or increasing the strength of this crisis is that people are losing their livelihoods every day. You are seeing the shrinking of Lake Chad. As it shrink, the millions of people, we see it in report that says that more than 40 million people depends on the Lake Chad alone for survival. And over time, this Lake Chad have shrunk, and now is displacing those millions of people away from their livelihood. And to some certain extent, some places are not accessible in the Lake Chad region. This armed group of people have taken over it. And that is why when we increase the livelihood, or we strengthen the livelihood in this region, definitely is going to help improve the security situation. We cannot keep using soldiers or military to fight this, because this is classically a climate-induced crisis. And I always used to stress it, that we can't use weapons or harm to deal with all of this crisis. If not, it's going to worsen the situation. Give these people alternative livelihoods that they can use to sustain themselves. Then you will see how it is going to improve the security factors in this region. Because the loss of livelihoods have become a powerful weapon against our peace and security in our modern days. That people are losing their livelihoods. I even saw a report that stated that in some region, some parents have to allow their children to go out there to join this armed group of people to get money, because they don't have this money. They are poor. So the environmental issue is affecting them. In Sahel region, 80% of the population depends on their landscape for survival. At the same time, it have displaced 80%. 80% of their landscape have been degraded. So you could see how it correlates with their livelihoods and people joining armed groups. So when people lose their livelihood, they become very vulnerable to armed groups. They can easily be recruited. I've written it in several of my articles on my blog, www.womenandcrisis.com, that as people lost their livelihood, there's always an increase or high rates of them being able to join armed group of people because they don't have alternative. And at the same time, they have pressure for them to join these people. So when we are providing alternative livelihoods, or we recharge the Lake Chad and make the Great Green Walk to work, because it has started since 2007, and yet we are not seeing any major improvement that we could say. It's now over a decade now. So when we give these people alternative livelihoods, or we bring back their livelihoods, like recharging the Lake Chad, then we will see how the security situation is going to improve greatly, because this is no longer we involving military or trying to use arms and ammunition to counter the effects. Rather, we need more climate action, not less. So we need to educate ourselves on where the problem lies first, before we could tackle those crises. So we need to use the right solution in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And, my next question actually is something you've already sort of alluded to. You described yourself as an ecofeminist. Do you mind telling us what that means? And at the same time, Flo, if you could put the next slide, we have a picture of you campaigning. Yeah, so if you could just tell us a bit more about what that, that stands for ecofeminist.
Okay, thank you. As an eco-feminist, I've seen that there is a great link between the degradation of our environment and that of women's rights. And that was why I've been campaigning that. Also, I wrote in a book that was just launched, that was last week, Stone Soup for Sustainable World. And I challenged the fact that when we are having Women's Week or International Women's Day, we have to include the factors of climate change because it's a pervasive or strong drivers of inequality in our society today. And at the same time, when we are celebrating World Environment Day, we must acknowledge the fact that women too needs to be included in this process, because we have seen that in the COVID-19 lockdown, that those that were disproportionately affected by the climate change, by those during the lockdown, were women, because they have lost their alternative livelihoods. So they have great pressure, and at the same time, they don't know where to seek for those to get them the alternative livelihoods, because their primary source of income comes from the land first, then before others follows. So there's a great great this thing it equates what is happening, because International Union for the Conservation of Nature also brought out from their research too. They get to see that there is a correlation between natural resources and the degradation of our environment to that of the violation of women and girls' rights. So that is why I call myself an eco-feminist, because I've been seeing it in Nigeria, in the Lake Chad region, in Sahel, in other African countries that I've seen those far, that definitely environmental rights should equate women's rights, because that is what it is. And our modern day democracy should be improved when we include nature to be part of it, because we have seen that women are part of nature. Everyone is part of nature. But when we talk about the closest part, when we talk about women going to distance to get water, we know that they are closer to nature. When we talk about women going to distance to get cooking materials or to look for alternative for their family, to stabilize their family, we know that women, this is a correlation that makes women to be closer to nature. So all of these things brings to the fact that our modern day democracy must change. We must suit it to what is happening in our society today, because democracy is the tools that we can use to solve societal issues. But now it is becoming fragile, because our environmental situation is disproportionately affecting our democracy. And that is why it is part of ecofeminism. And I've written the article to give that correlation using an ecofeminist view on why we need to integrate nature to be part of our democracy, because we know that in Africa, we depend on democracy for everything. And once democracy fails, it might totally lead to war. And that is what climate change can create. When it creates ethnic division, it creates religious division, it creates political instability, definitely democracy lives or breaks. So these are issues that ecofeminism seeks to address. How do we get things moving? How do we do things that our society will become balanced? And when we are talking about ecofeminism, we are not talking about the fact that we need to take men's role, or we want to share in men's role. Everyone has a role to play. And so when there's any imbalances in any role, then it's going to affect the whole chain. And that is why we need women to take their space so that they could contribute economically, socially, environmental wise, and that way is going to bring an equitable solutions to the whole world and to solve it as societal issues. Thank you.
Thank you. I have one more question for you. So in 2019, you started your own company called I Lead Climate. Maybe you can just share a little bit with us about what you are doing and to bring about change.
Okay, thank you so much. The I Lead Climate is a Pan-African movement that tries to seek how we can help to bring solutions, and now we can be part of the solutions in solving the defining issue of our time. And you can check our blog, it's there, www.womenandcrisis.com. It gives a vivid explanation of what we stand for. And recently we are into a project that we were involved in, that is to develop a course, like a modulus on ecofeminism and climate change in Africa. And once the course is up, I will definitely post it on my social media handles for people to go get that course. It will be taught by African and Afro women descendants. That is the course that it's all about ecofeminism and climate change. And that is what I'm writing on right now after this. And I'm going to also continue to see how many people this course can influence, the thousands of people that could take this course and get to understand the situation, the environmental aspect of climate change, ecofeminism, everything you need to know about climate change in Africa, the solutions, where the problem lies, and different things. And I'm sure that is going to be an eye-opener to many situations in our country today. So those are the projects that we are being involved in currently. And you could also check our article in Queen of Commonwealth Trust Fund, video too, that they help to highlight using their platform to help to showcase what we are doing. And recently, I got an interaction with some people on how we can make a prototype of what the Great Green Wall should look like, so that it could inspire action that is needed to see how we can accomplish these Great Green Wall issues and how we can solve climate-induced conflicts through disarmament. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sure everyone is going to join me in thanking you for joining us today and for sharing those very important insights with us. Thank you for your voice, and thank you for your advocacy work in raising awareness and campaigning for change in terms of climate change and gender. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I do encourage you to please share the blog you mentioned and the link to your website to the chat box for anyone who would like to find out more about your work. Okay, thank you. All right, so now moving straight into session 4. Okay, all right, so now moving on straight into session 4 on tracking expenditure, budget execution and audit. I am very happy to introduce Daisy Mukarakate. She's the Senior Regional Policy Advisor on Climate Change at the United Nations Development Programme. Daisy also leads Component B of the Inclusive Budgeting and Financing for Climate Change in Africa, which supports governments with introducing climate-related reforms. Daisy, over to you.
Thank you, Shanaz, and good morning, colleagues. First of all, I want to thank countries that presented yesterday. We had very rich sessions yesterday. Thank you, and also a big thank you to Adenike for giving us insights on the gender, climate, and peace nexus in the Lake Chad Basin. I must say those issues are very close to UNDP. We have very big programs. We have the Lake Chad Basin Commission program, where I think you saw the figures that Adenike was projecting. Those figures are from a UNDP program. We also have a what we call PVE, Prevention of Violent Extremism, again in the region, a very big program. And we have been advocating for exactly what Adenike was saying, that we don't really need military solutions all the time. So we are beginning to deploy what we call peace and development advisors, but we are including somebody with a profile on environment, climate, and natural resources. So things are beginning to happen. And also we are hiring what we call climate security specialists. You find that the farmer-header conflicts that we have in West Africa and in East Africa, You cannot solve them solely by military solutions. So I want to thank you again, Adenike. Let me move to session 4. Session 4 is on tracking expenditure, budget execution, and audit. We have 2 countries. We have South Africa and Mozambique. And then after the presentation from South Africa and Mozambique, Kit Nicholson from Climate Security will also give us his insights on common challenges and possible solutions for reforms. We have 1 hour. So what I will do is I'll give 15 minutes to each presenter, to South Africa, to Mozambique, and to Kit, climate security. But if you can make it in less than 50 minutes, thank you, because I want to reserve 15 minutes for some interaction. I think yesterday we didn't have people speaking from the floor. I would really like to have people speaking from the floor today. So let me start with, we have a joint presentation from Prudence, who is the Director of Budget Reform, and from Magazi, who is the Director of Environment, Science and Tourism from the National Treasury of South Africa. They will present on gender and climate budget reforms in South Africa. Over to you. And it's also very good to, by the way, to see a joint presentation from my PFM and then a climate environment person. Thank you. Let me give the floor to South Africa. Thank you very much. Over to you, South Africa. Thanks.
Good morning. My name is Prudence Cele. Thank you, Daisy. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Adelige. I think that was really inspiring. I think it's a different perspective of climate and gender. And it is very, very welcomed. I think when we have young people such as yourself investigating the causes of all the crises we have in the continent, we have a better future that we can look forward to. I will not be moving my slide. I see on the screen that the interpreted slides are being beamed, so please just make sure that you've selected the right language for yourself so that you can see the English version, as I do not have the hosting to my own presentation. I will do a quick 5 to 8 minutes presentation so that Gobisa, my colleague, who will take us through this climate budget tagging process that we are undertaking. So I will just be looking at the agenda presentation. Please let me know if I am too fast so I can slow down for the interpreters. Thank you so much. Okay, so the outline of the presentation, I will be just looking at the history of what we basically had before in the South African context when it comes to gender, and background on some of the legislations that exist and our framework that was introduced in 2019, and what we have done in terms of trying to collect the data for gender in the budgeting system, and what we're required to share or to report on with the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities, and the assistance we have since required from the International Monetary Fund in terms of implementation. And I will look at the purpose of the mission and the lessons we've learned thus far in our journey of gender responsive budgeting. So I'm on the next slide on history. Yes, that's the correct one. So post-1994, as some of you may know, the South African government initiated a women budget initiative, which was not necessarily done through the finance ministry, but was led outside of government by people in parliament, civil society organizations, and mainly because most of the advocates at the time were the natural people to push anything that has been lagging behind. So they then take the initiative to say, how do we integrate advocacy work with the government and of the work that is being done in the new dispensation of democracy? So it was a very a good initiative that aimed at taking cognizance of some of the multi-factors that we were dealing with in South Africa, including single parenthood, gender issues, and rural and poor and informal sectors that existed at the time. So Parliament, government, and CSO were collaborating in that initiative. But some of the challenges we encountered is that we were not able to sustain it. Hence, now we are starting a whole new process with this new framework. So the reasons why this was not sustainable is it was not institutionalized. So that is one of the key things and key lessons from the budget, the Women's Budget Initiative, is that if something of this nature is not institutionalized, within government, within the legislature, in any sphere, it will not be sustainable. So there were some publications, there was one of the documents that were published during the budget at the time had some indication of how much was going to gender. It was like a synopsis of the attention we're paying to gender issues at the time, but that was not institutionalized. So it dropped when the initiative stopped. And because the nature of civil society is so dynamic, you cannot hold on to a certain group that exists at a time at a later stage is not there anymore. So the institutionalization must happen within government so that it forms the fabric of the government system. And also another good thing that was happening at a time, the economic environment was also very different. So it allowed for colleagues to be able to incentivize or even look at opportunities. And then the context that we find ourselves in now is very difficult to innovate as you are constrained, and the only language you're communicating to departments or anyone is that of savings. And another good thing that came from the initiative is that we learned that government, civil society, and Parliament are able to work together on an initiative. The background, I'm on the third slide now. So now the background is that we have a commitment of equity incident study that we did at the National Treasury. Our economic policy unit did that study. So the results of that were that we found that there is no direct relationship between the fiscal policy stance of the South African government and inequality. But what we need to also emphasize in this is that even though the results look like they're impressive, you must understand that the study was done and because previously we had inequality, such high inequality in our country, and it only makes sense that when we introduce fiscal policy, it will be pro-social. So when we looked at that study, it was looking at how big, obviously, our social security budget is and so on, but it does not take into account things such as the quality of services that we receive, and it is also it is limited in that instance. So you are given a myopic perspective. So it did not go deeper. It just gave an overview that showed that our social spending and it does not necessarily our fiscal policy does not necessarily affect women in a negative way, but as I've mentioned, it's very impartial. So that was the first start in our attempt to now come back on the gender agenda. And then in 2019, the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities introduced a framework which they had key things which some of the countries highlighted yesterday that they thought needed to be done by the Ministry of Finance. And then it is requirements such as the MTEF guidelines must include something about gender, what others would call a budget circular, which should have an indication of gender priorities. But we made this call to align with the requirements of the framework, and then we called for departments to provide disaggregated data in 2019 and 2020. However, the information received was not of very good quality. We could not be able to inform policy decisions. We had people who were very responsive were those who already had data in a disaggregated format. For example, Department of Higher Education, who would naturally have people at youth who will show then gender allocations for male and females. So that was already something that was in place. And so it was we were finding it very, very difficult to have the numbers talk to informing budget decisions. And the timing of the collection also became apparent that we are going to have an issue in terms of collecting and speaking about what needs to be done in this system. And we found that most of the responses were mostly malicious. And then this is a sample of the data that was collected. We have over 40 votes in the South African government. That is, we refer to them as votes because the funds must be voted on to be spent. So the votes are the departments themselves. So you can see this is just a short a summary of what they would show. And as I've said, it will be malicious. Sometimes it'll give you 50% of what is spent on basic education, which is not very useful. So we realized that, you know what, there are some issues in terms of the requirements of the framework, and sometimes complying with the framework from a policy department is not sufficient to institutionalize or mainstream gender. There needs to be some background work that needs to be done to be able to prepare the stakeholders, departments, and all institutions that are involved to do their part. So this is just the summary of some of the requirements I've mentioned that are in this framework. So as the circular itself, they request that budget bids should demonstrate allocations, and we also are discouraging the discussion about bids in this current economic conditions, because we are saying people must just reprioritize. There is no room for new funding. So those are the kind of things that we are facing. And then there's a requirement that the estimates of national expenditure, this is now our estimates for the next budget that you're going to spend, and our adjustments should include a section on women, which is something that was done before, but we need to be able to have the data to be able to do that kind of presentation on the documentation. And this information is required on a quarterly basis. These are some of the checklists that have given unto us. And then also that the interventions should be shown in our medium-term budget policy statements and in the budget speech itself. And also there's a recommendation also to change the Treasury regulations, but we were not very clear in terms of what we wanted to say. But I appreciate the examples that colleagues also provided yesterday, and also to have the similar process with the provincial treasuries. And most recently, there's been a requirement announced by the president that there needs to be a 40% that goes to women in terms of procurement in government. So those kind of things are what have been put in place to be able to push the gender initiative. Sorry, I'm leaving you behind. I was on slide 7. Now I'm moving on to slide 8. So we requested the IMF assistance mainly because of the issues I've already mentioned, that implementation is not going to be done in isolation, and we don't want it to be a tick box exercise where we just say, I had a line in the budget circular and that was done, or maybe the data is there but nobody is using it, or even informing any policy decisions. It's not having an impact on the ground. We said we wrote to the IMF, they conducted a training, and then we were interested in maybe getting more insights in where the gaps could be in the South African context. The mission is taking place as we speak. We've been doing it for 2 weeks now. It's gonna be ending in the middle of July, where the IMF will make some recommendations in terms of what they see the gaps as it currently stands. So the purpose was mainly for us to start an initiative that will find solutions for the South African context. Next slide, please. So the purpose is to have a roadmap of action for the National Treasury, establish common understanding. We realize that throughout all government that there is different interpretation of what gender responsive budgeting looks like. Sometimes gender responsive budgeting is not necessarily that I put it in the guideline as I've mentioned, but rather having the impact. And also, where do you want to see it? Is having a social spend that includes women as beneficiaries enough as gender responsive budgeting, or do we want to transform even the economic side of things where women are empowered to contribute into the economy as well? And also, we wanted to gather data on progress since the initiation of the framework for gender responsive budgeting, reporting, planning, monitoring, and evaluation. And also to identify gaps in this system and assess the readiness of government, and also learn some lessons from other countries. So the lessons that we learned now is that the guidelines and template can never replace any training and buy-in by the departments and the sectors. On slide 10. So that can never replace the buy-in, that can never replace the training, that can never replace the sector agenda and objective setting and planning into their sector indicators as well. So just simply having a few requirements cannot be regarded as gender responsive budgeting, and people who prepare the submissions that we receive, for especially for the National Treasury, are not the people who are trained. And obviously then we also have situations whereby the budget structures themselves do not allow for ease of disaggregation, because now you find that there's a program, a sub program that is doing some regional, some gender initiatives, but it's not clear. So we need to relook our budget structures, but obviously that has to start with the plan itself. And then prioritization is not guaranteed by simply issuing a framework. So we need to set clear objectives to say, what is it that we want this gender responsive budgeting to achieve? What do we want to do with it? Do we want to just estimate the financing gap and have actions? Do we want to monitor what currently is in the system, because there is funding in the system that is already dedicated to gender issues? So those are my slides. I will stop there for my presentation, and I'll ask that we show Xobisa's presentation before we do the questions for the sake of time. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you very much, Prudence. Let's move to Xobisa then. We are running behind time. So Xobisa, if you can make it very fast, thank you.
Sure, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Xobisa Magazi, as already highlighted. I will talk through the process of developing a framework for climate budget taking in South Africa. And basically in starting with that presentation, I'll just provide a policy context of climate change and how these have been translated into a process into looking into a diagnostic of the National Treasury and what role the National Treasury can play in the context of climate change. I will also then delve into the process underway, which we are implementing in collaboration with the World Bank, assisted also by a group of consultants who've been commissioned to do the work on behalf of Treasury and the World Bank. In terms of, I'm on slide 3, in terms of the South African climate change policy context, climate change is being increasingly recognized as a transversal priority affecting social and economic development by the South African government. This has seen us also including a specific chapter on issues pertaining to environmental sustainability, climate resilience, and low carbon economy and just society. And these have also been equally translated into our existing and previous iteration of the medium-term strategic frameworks. As colleagues will be aware as well, similarly with other countries, South Africa has made commitments in terms of nationally determined contributions to the United Nations. And to that extent, South Africa is committed to an emissions trajectory that peaks during 2020, 2025, and plateaus over a decade and then declines in absolute terms into the 2050. Currently, we are in the process of updating the NDC, and which will be submitted as a build-up to COP26. The NDC in itself will enable South Africa to position itself internationally at the same time as addressing domestic development and requirements for a sustainable, ambitious, and just transition, climate transition. Complementary to these, of course, there are several sectoral policies and strategies that are in place. One being the South African LEADS strategy, which is the low emissions development strategy that was endorsed by Cabinet in 2020, which basically sets out the trajectory to and the pathways leading to 2050. And what we then see is that for the rapid transition to take place, it will require, it poses a significant amount of risk in terms of the economy and sustainable development, and therefore requires a lot of management, especially where it comes to also developing macroeconomic and fiscal and budgetary tools that will support the transition itself. And what we then also regard as quite a crucial importance is how to integrate this particular risk and opportunities into the fiscal and economic modeling process. And also there is a requirement that is placed by these plans for mobilization of additional resources. Of course, the bulk of these resources are not necessarily going to come from a public finance point of view. The resources will be mobilized from different sources, which include multilateral developmental finance institutions, as well as private sector. But we do also need to also look into what would be the requirement from a public sector point of view. And what we also recognize increasingly is the role that the National Treasury can play in terms of these particular opportunities and risks, and especially as an institution that sits at the center of policy and sectoral resource planning in government. So those are some of the issues that we have taken into account. On slide 4, we are also quite cognizant that there are also other complementary sectoral policies and measures towards decarbonizing the economy, such as the Green Transport Strategy and the RP 2019, as well as also some of our own initiatives that have been initiated from the side of National Treasury in terms of the carbon tax phase 1 and phase 2, which supports the point that I've already made around the need to mobilize additional resources, and in some instances also provide measures for recycling of revenue. So in support of these policy measures, as I've mentioned, it requires a lot of reorientation of public finances. It also requires an introduction of fiscal policy levers that can be applied in all 3 spheres of government. And closer to home, it also requires a lot of changes in terms of our existing incentive regimes across the different sectors of the economy. So we then, as a country, saw that it would be necessary perhaps to, as a starting point of such initiatives that could be led by the National Treasury, to see how we can strengthen the mechanisms to mainstream climate change response into the intergovernmental fiscal budgetary system. And that entails basically looking into all 3 spheres of government And the climate budget tagging project was seen as a good starting point of such in terms of understanding whether spending is aligned to the needs, given the climate risk and vulnerabilities faced by different sectors of society. As I've already alluded in my previous slide, there is a diagnostic assessment of National Treasury that is underway, which also highlighted the climate budget taking as one of the potential areas in which the National Treasury could strengthen the response to climate change. I'm on slide 5. So on slide 5, what you see before you is basically an illustration of the National Treasury and how supporting the point that I had made earlier on as the institution as a converging center in government in terms of policy and resourcing of plans. So there are certain issues that we, of course, I've already explained the issues around the NDP, and also that there is also the National Climate Change Response Policy that was passed by the Department of my government, and also the inclusion into the MTSF, and also the issues around the development of the South African leads, as well as the adaptation strategies. So where we see these things, where they converge, they require a lot of cross-government planning, with the National Treasury sitting at the center, as I've mentioned already, and where we see the specific levels that could apply, be applied by the National Treasury is in terms of developing macroeconomic frameworks and also supporting the integration of climate change into national budget and expenditure frameworks, as well as the need, of course, to develop our green financing and sustainable finance models, and which also touch also part of the regulatory role that we play in terms of private sector and other. And of course, there's the issues that will also relate to issues around procurement, which I think have been also touched by previous presenters from other countries as well. On slide 6, we then basically provide the key objectives that have been considered by South Africa in the process that I've already mentioned that is underway in developing a climate budget tagging framework for the country. So some of the key objectives as defined by South Africa in terms of the survey that we had conducted with some of the departments that will be participating in the process, as well as the different structures of government and an advisory committee that is leading and overseeing the work in terms of the climate budget taking. These objectives are to influence budget and policy decisions at all levels to be more climate relevant, improving the effectiveness of climate relevant budgeting and policy decisions, assessing the national gap and enabling accountability for climate change responsibilities, and reporting on climate change strategies and plans and commitments. The CBT is basically centered around our initiative in terms of the CBT is centered around 4 or 5 main core design parameters. One, which is one that basically set out the approach that will be followed by the country, the coverage of the system, how the climate relevance will be defined, classified, and scored, and how will associated expenditures be weighed, how the tags will be generated in South African public resource management cycles, and how the information will then be used or reporting, and how then the overall system will be governed as well. In terms of slide number 7, we then just try to define the design parameters in terms of the approach. So there has been a lot of key considerations that we have taken into account in terms of how we design a CBT for South Africa. One such consideration has also been premised on the fact that the South African intergovernmental fiscal system has characteristics of fiscal decentralization, which means basically the assignment and distribution of expenditure and responsibilities is across different spheres, with also some level of autonomy in terms of political and administrative accountability on those and decision making when it comes to issues around budgeting. So there is also another consideration, a layer of consideration that we've taken into account is that there are level of disparities in terms of the budget cycles, whereas you also, and our financial years are not necessarily aligned in terms of the national and local government spheres of government. There's also the issues around variations in terms of budgeting and accounting reporting systems as well. Another key considerations that we've taken into account is that the intention as set out by the National Treasury in consultation with some of the departments that are participating in that advisory committee structure is that the rollout of this should be applicable in all three spheres of government. And another major consideration that we had to take into account in terms of approach is what definition would we be using in South Africa, and how do we best incorporate issues pertaining to just transition. And as a result, we are following an approach that would be taking a hybrid approach in terms of scoring, weighing expenditure relevance, taking into account both the objectives and net assets of expenditure. And one other consideration in terms of the approach is that what we would like as South Africa is that a CBT system would need to be embedded in government planning and budget preparation and financial management and reporting cycles. Effectively, it should be taken into all those three, all four cycles of budgeting. What we also envisaging in terms of the approach is that the institutionalization of the CBT will take over a period of 5 years, commencing once the pilot has been concluded in the chosen sites of piloting. On slide 8, we basically now looking into the design parameters as it relates to the coverage. As I've already mentioned, the coverage of the CBT as proposed by South Africa will be across the 3 spheres of government, and it will also be within spheres as well, and will be rolled out over a period of 5 years. The coverage will also include public entities, particularly those public entities that have are in sectors that are relevant to climate change policy. And a key consideration in terms of this is in terms of our ExCom, which is the energy sector, the transport and infrastructure public entities such as the water boards. And these will be mostly likely incorporated into a phase 2 of the process, which will also involve a stress testing approach in terms of those selected public entities as well. Another key consideration in terms of coverage from a South African perspective is that we would also look into whether we could include negative programs. These would be programs that contribute negatively or harmfully to the environment and society. And we would want to also see how these can be incorporated into that process. Another consideration that we've taken into account in terms of coverage is whether we should include donor finance expenditure. And the reason being is that there is a lot of climate-related ODA, official ODA, that is coming into the country that would be equally relevant. But however, the decision on whether to include this or not will be subject to consultation within the National Treasury. As I've already mentioned, the other dimension of our coverage will also include the issues around just transition. Another aspect of our design parameters for the CBT has been a consideration of climate change relevance. So what we have, of course, in terms of this part is also looking into the definitions that we would use in terms of determining what is climate change relevant. So the definitions that are going to be used will be primarily in line with the OECD related definitions, but of course also be expanded to include the just transition component as per the policy directives or positions of the country. So we would also need to explore how to do this in material development and tests in the pilot sites, and would need to equally plan to identify expenditure on climate related losses and damages, but this could be implemented at a later stage as well. Another key issue that we have considered in terms of climate relevance is whether we are going to look at identifying only climate change relevance on the basis that there is explicit or implicit alignment to the climate change relevance. So by this, we would be looking into, because some of the programs are designed by design are not necessarily related to issues of climate change. However, when you have to actually look into their implied relevance, you may find that, for instance, some of the initiatives actually do contribute to issues of climate change, though they may have been set with a primarily or developmental objective that does not really relate to issues of environment. So that has been one of the things that we would take into account in terms of climate relevance. And of course, linked to also the issues, the last point that I've made in terms of the design parameters is the issues around benefits versus objectives-based assessment of degree of relevance. By objective-based, we would be looking into the degree to which objectives are relevant to climate change mitigation and adaptation measures. when it comes to benefit-based, we would need to differentiate between benefits of expenditure that is generated under business as usual versus those that are generated for purposes of climate change. Both of these methodologies would need to be assessed consistently. And in terms of our thinking parameters, we will probably go for a situation that takes both into account. So another key decision is a base system, is whether a base system has to be one or the other. So the stakeholder preferences at this stage is that in terms of the engagements that we've had internally and outside of Treasury, is that the preference is for a mixed base type of a system, where pilots will therefore be used to test the benefit-based assessment type of arrangements. So in terms of the objectives-based, the South African method, as I've already explained, is that it will be basically an adjustment of the Rio markers approach in terms of scoring, where you look into the principal and the significance, and whether there is significance or minor significance, and we will then do the weighting accordingly. So the general appetite is to include benefit-based assessments because of the interest in terms of effectiveness of climate change policies and impacts. So slide number 11, basically, another key design parameter that we have considered is the location in South African PFM cycles. So while the taking will be primarily at the budgetary planning, but in execution stages of the budget, there is also key considerations that we should also take the climate budget taking, we should also doing at the planning level. And that would be part of the next phases that we would need to consider in terms of the rollout of the plan. We are also equally mindful of the fact that, as I've also mentioned in the previous slides, that we are mindful of a holistic approach in terms of we need to see the tagging translated in all phases, the distinctive phases of budget planning, where we also look into the reporting side of things, where we're also looking into the auditing side of things. As a result, we do have plans to also engage with the externally of Treasury, where we're also looking into Parliament and trying to get their views as to how we can approach the CBT, as well as also incorporating the Auditor General in the process as well. I think just before I close off, on slide number 12, what we have basically before you is a mapping of the process as it stands. So as I've mentioned, we're still in the early stages of developing the framework, with the pilot soon to be rolled out. So we're still also going to be undertaking a capacity needs assessment in some of the pilot sites, just to see what are the gaps in terms of and the level of readiness if we were to roll out a pilot into those specific chosen sites. As I've also mentioned, that the whole design of and development of the CBT approach for South Africa is in consultation with major departments, which outside of Treasury include the Department of Forestry and Environment, the Department of Planning and Monitoring, the likes of Department of Cooperative Governance, Transport and Water, and Department of Energy, as well as some of the provincial departments and metros and the provincial treasuries. So where we are in terms of the process is we are now going to be initiating the capacity needs assessments, and we will also simultaneously also start rolling out the pilots. So the pilot projects in its, the approach in terms of the pilot is that we are going to have 9 pilot sites, which will be rolled out in all 3 spheres of government in 3 major sectors, which is the energy sector, agricultural sector, and also we would also do a pilot that's looking internally within the National Treasury, which will be a stress testing in terms of trying to determine what is the level of readiness and what are the capacity needs in terms of National Treasury. And of course, there is a plan to pilot the CBT into the 3 spheres and inclusive of the municipalities, as I've already mentioned. So what we have also done in terms of determining where the pilot will be rolled out is that a lot of consideration went into the relevance of those particular sectors in terms of government's policy in terms of climate change, We've also looked into the extent of vulnerability and also considered and tried to really come up with a mix of the different provinces and municipalities that we're going to select for the pilot in terms of their own current gaps and needs, and also try to integrate to a certain extent secondary metros where you would not ordinarily have the most advanced know-how in terms of issues around climate change as well. So I think I will, in the interest of time, I will end the presentation there. And I think what I will just mention to colleagues as a parting shot is that we have not really gone through an extensive process. As I've said, that we are still in the rolling out phases. So we do not have much of issues that we can offer as lessons learned at the stage, but it's just to explain the process that is underway and how the process will ensue. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you very much, Thobisa, for that very rich presentation. I think colleagues will agree with me that a lot has gone into the thought process for the design of the South Africa climate budget tagging system, taking into consideration, of course, the national context, like we are looking at just transition. I will not try to summarize because it was really rich. I think we need a full day for this, maybe follow-up webinars. In the interest of time, let me quickly move to Mozambique. And then what I will do is I'll take questions at the end of the Mozambique presentation. I'll take questions. We already have 4 questions from, if I remember, Zolani, James, Josephine, and Louis. I'll take those questions at the end of the Mozambique presentation. Thank you. Let me introduce Marcio. I hope I pronounced it well. He's a senior budget and accounting technician, Ministry of Finance, Mozambique. Marcio will talk about gender and climate change in the public audit. Over to you, Mozambique. Thank you. If you can make it, let's see, 11:27. If you can please make it until 11:27, which is in 12 minutes or less, that would be good. Thank you so much. Over to you, Mozambique.
Muito bom dia e muito obrigado pela oportunidade. Não sei se me consigo fazer ouvir. Conforme apresentado, eu sou Márcio Gonzaga, sou técnico da Direção Nacional de Planificação e Orçamento e no meu trabalho diário tenho lidado com matérias de planificação e orçamentação, dos quais o gênero e mudanças climáticas fazem parte como assuntos transversais. Dizer que nós fizemos um pequeno ajuste do tema que nos foi proposto, que é para poder adequá-lo melhor à experiência que pretendemos trazer, pretendemos partilhar aqui com todos vocês. E o que vamos partilhar aqui foi elaborado com base naquilo que é a experiência do país, naquilo que tem sido a nossa forma de atuar como planificadores, e partindo mesmo para a apresentação, importa referir que estamos ainda a aprimorar os nossos instrumentos e a nossa forma de atuar, ainda não alcançamos a perfeição, mas todas as oportunidades que nos surgem, nós aproveitamos para aprimorar e melhorar a nossa atuação como planificadores de desenvolvimento, não é? Falando do enquadramento do gênero na planificação e orçamentação, importa dizer que... Próximo slide, please. Podia passar para o próximo slide, que pretendemos fazer um enquadramento. Sim, muito obrigado. Não vamos nos debruçar muito sobre questões teóricas, mas interessa dizer que para nós fazer a planificação na ótica do gênero significa incorporar todas as nuances que têm a ver com o gênero nos planos e programas nacionais, desde as suas fases prematuras até a parte conclusiva, respeitando sempre as diferenças ou as potencialidades e especificidades que cada homem e cada mulher apresenta. Relativamente à orçamentação, também temos a questão do género incorporada na orçamentação, que sabemos que é conhecida como GRB, não é? Planificação sensível ao género. É uma abordagem que nós também temos assumido nos nossos programas nacionais e que pode ser entendida como atender a todas as questões de género, incorporando essa dimensão de género no processo da orçamentação, avaliação, monitoreia e avaliação dos orçamentos públicos. Aqui, deixem-me sublinhar que fazer uma orçamentação de género não significa necessariamente que exista alguma linha orçamental, alguma rúbrica ou um orçamento paralelo destinado exclusivamente a atender as necessidades ligadas ao género. Próximo slide. Bom, aqui trago uma fotografia que tirei a alguns amiguinhos meus. É uma imagem ilustrativa em que mostramos os riscos de nós darmos as mesmas oportunidades a todos sem atendermos às especificidades de cada um. É interessante, é bom que todos sejam sujeitos às mesmas oportunidades, tenham acesso aos mesmos recursos, mas se nós não atendermos que cada um tem a sua especificidade, nós poderemos reduzir a zero, poderemos reduzir a neutralidade esta nossa orçamentação. Como podem ver aqui, o nosso amiguinho macaquinho está feliz porque é o único que apresenta condições para realizar o exame que se propõe com sucesso. Então, se nós abordarmos por uma neutralidade na nossa orçamentação em relação ao género, excluiremos algumas pessoas, não é? Quer sejam homens, quer sejam mulheres, se não atendermos às suas especificidades. Próximo slide. Peço para que se passe. Não sei se há de ser um problema aqui da conexão, mas está a levar algum tempo para fazer a transição. Bom, vou fazer agora o enquadramento das mudanças climáticas na planificação e orçamentação. Próximo slide. E aqui interessa-nos dizer que as mudanças climáticas, tanto como o próprio género, são enquadrados nos assuntos transversais. Existem vários assuntos transversais, mas para o presente plano quinquenal do governo, nós temos como eleição alguns assuntos transversais, tal é o caso do género, segurança alimentar e nutricional, gestão sustentável de recursos naturais e ambiente, a redução de risco de desastres e as mudanças climáticas, naturalmente, HIV-Sida, desenvolvimento rural, entre outros, mas estes são os mais relevantes. Lembrando que os assuntos transversais são aquelas matérias que ultrapassam a dimensão de um único setor, né? Todos os setores devem procurar atender, embora tenham um setor que os coordene, né? E eu destaquei aqui o gênero e as mudanças climáticas, não só por serem o assunto o motor desta conferência, mas porque julgo que estes dois assuntos transversais conseguem ser transversais até mesmo dentro dos demais assuntos transversais. Por exemplo, o gênero, no que diz respeito à segurança alimentar, a provisão de alimentos dentro de uma família geralmente é feita pelas mulheres. Então, ao fazermos a abordagem da segurança alimentar e nutricional, temos sempre que atender às questões do gênero. O mesmo acontece com as mudanças climáticas. Sabemos que a segurança alimentar e nutricional, por exemplo, pressupõe a produção de alimentos. E a produção de alimentos é muito afetada pelas mudanças climáticas. Então, dentro deste assunto transversal, que é a segurança alimentar e nutricional, nós temos que também trazer a abordagem das mudanças climáticas, razão pela qual consideramos que o gênero e as mudanças climáticas são assuntos transversais, até mesmo dentro dos demais assuntos transversais, razão pela qual merecem este nosso destaque e são, de facto, muito considerados dentro dos nossos planos nacionais. Próximo slide. Falando já do gênero e mudanças climáticas, fazendo este cruzamento, eu quero aqui trazer uma visão de como é que estes dois assuntos transversais conseguem estar casados, há um link entre eles, não é? Por exemplo, no que diz respeito ao acesso à água potável, as mulheres elas são responsáveis pela coleta de água, não é? E se, pelos efeitos das mudanças climáticas, nós temos uma menor disponibilidade de água, significa que estas mulheres terão que percorrer distâncias maiores para trazer a água. E isto vai roubar-lhes tempo de produção, vai lhes roubar tempo de poder aceder a outras oportunidades de desenvolvimento. Então, havendo esta escassez de fontes de água resultantes das mudanças climáticas, o impacto sobre as mulheres acaba sendo um bocadinho maior se comparado com outros segmentos da sociedade. O mesmo acontece na agricultura. Sabemos que as mudanças climáticas agravam os efeitos da seca ou inundações e afetando desta forma a produção agrária, e isto pode afetar o desenvolvimento das mulheres. Por quê? Porque quando há secas e inundações, a produção baixa e os recursos escasseiam. E numa situação de conflito ou numa situação de concorrência pelos recursos, as mulheres, por serem a ala menos favorecida na sociedade, elas acabam sendo afetadas, razão pela qual nós temos que desenhar programas que ajudem as mulheres a superar ou a cobrir este déficit ao qual elas são submetidas. O mesmo acontece no que diz respeito aos desastres naturais, como cheias, inundações, ciclones e outros eventos extremos. As mulheres, geralmente, por questões culturais, elas não têm acesso à informação, não têm acesso à formação, o que torna-lhes menos habilitadas para resistir ou ter resiliência aos desastres naturais. Próximo slide. Bom, enquanto o próximo slide vem, nós trouxemos este quadro mesmo para mostrar que as mudanças climáticas afetam ou impactam os homens e mulheres de formas diferentes. Geralmente o impacto sobre as mulheres é um bocadinho maior, razão pela qual os nossos programas de desenvolvimento devem sempre considerar este facto na sua elaboração. Então, para incorporar a perspectiva de gênero em todos os programas, é crucial identificar as ferramentas que já existem e que vinculam os diferentes setores e garantam um avanço coordenado em direção a políticas de adaptação sensíveis ao gênero. Temos exemplos disso já nos nossos instrumentos de planificação. Temos o Plano Nacional de Ação para o Avanço da Mulher, temos o Plano Nacional de Prevenção e Combate à Violência da Mulher, temos a Política de Gênero e Estratégia da sua implementação, que são instrumentos que concorrem para o empoderamento da mulher e obrigam as instituições a trazer dentro dos seus planos esta abordagem de gênero. Estes são apenas exemplos, temos outros tantos instrumentos. Próximo slide. Continuando, as mudanças climáticas, entendemos nós que são uma oportunidade de nós redefinirmos ou repensarmos as nossas políticas com enfoque maior sobre o gênero e trazer soluções que respondam a um desenvolvimento sustentável e, ao mesmo tempo, diminuam as desigualdades entre os homens e as mulheres. Temos exemplo disso, a Lei de Terras, que dentro de todo o seu manancial tem ali alguns artigos que ajudam a salvaguardar os direitos da mulher, dando-lhes acesso à terra e também estabelecem alguns direitos iguais, tanto para homens como para mulheres, isto relacionado à terra. Temos também a Lei da Família, que é um instrumento recentemente aprovado, que elimina aquela supremacia masculina e dá às mulheres uma maior oportunidade de administrar as propriedades, não é? E gerir melhor as oportunidades que lhes são colocadas. Próximo slide. Para nós fazermos uma planificação e orçamentação, na óptica de género, nós precisamos de atender a alguns pressupostos. Primeiro, nós temos que conhecer os instrumentos
Hello,
de
Matthew,
planificação.
can I jump in, please? We have only 3 minutes left. Are you able to wrap up in 3 minutes? Thank you. Sorry for the interjection.
Ok, thank you. Assim sendo, peço para passar para o próximo slide. Podemos dispensar este. Próximo slide. Pode passar. Nós queremos aqui apresentar alguns instrumentos de planificação, dizer que o nosso PQG, ou Plano Quinquenal do Governo, ele foi elaborado em perfeito ou em estrito alinhamento com os Objetivos de Desenvolvimento Sustentável. E estes Objetivos de Desenvolvimento Sustentável já trazem consigo a abordagem de género e mudanças climáticas. E, havendo alinhamento entre o nosso Plano Quinquenal e os ODS, criamos instrumentos que ajudam a integrar estes assuntos transversais, o género e mudanças climáticas. Podemos passar para o próximo slide. Dizer que nós, neste momento, estamos a desenvolver uma nova abordagem de planificação e orçamentação. Anteriormente, ou pelo menos até o exercício de 2021, nós fazíamos a planificação e a orçamentação de forma separada, tanto que o orçamento do Estado tinha força de lei e a planificação, ou o plano econômico social não tinha. Peço para passar para o próximo slide. Para os próximos exercícios, nós passaremos a ter um único instrumento que vai permitir o link entre a planificação e a orçamentação, e ambos, ou este instrumento único, passará a ser aprovado por lei. Estando incorporada, próximo slide, estando incorporada a planificação e a orçamentação num único documento, passará a ser aprovado pela Assembleia da República e terá a força de lei. E dentro deste plano econômico e social, temos lá ações que potenciam o empoderamento da mulher e a integração das mudanças climáticas. Este é um exemplo de como é que fica arrumado a questão de género. Próximo slide. Trago um slide que também mostra no nosso plano econômico e social a questão da integração das mudanças climáticas. Próximo slide. Enquanto o slide não vem, dizer que nós temos um mecanismo de rastreio de todo orçamento dedicado ou das ações que concorrem para a integração das mudanças climáticas e assim também para o género, e para tal nós temos um classificador dentro do orçamento do Estado que permite rastrear aquelas ações que são programadas e realizadas que concorrem para a promoção do género, assim como das mudanças climáticas. Próximo slide, talvez o penúltimo slide, onde eu poderei mostrar como é que está feita a organização destes classificadores no orçamento do Estado. Bom, vou esgotar os meus 3 minutos ainda à espera da transição. Portanto, o orçamento do Estado, ele já, desta forma, havendo esta forma de traquear ou de rastrear a inclusão do género e das mudanças climáticas, ele já permite que nós saibamos quanto é que foi investido para atender a questões de género e quanto é que foi investido para atender a questões de mudanças climáticas, mas lembrando que não existem necessariamente orçamentos paralelos para atender a esses assuntos transversais. Tudo que é feito para atender estes assuntos transversais já está incluído naquelas ações correntes que os setores realizam ao longo do exercício econômico. Bom, creio ter esgotado o que vem nos slides a seguir, que não foram aqui apresentados. Mesmo por interesse de tempo, eu vou terminar por aqui e agradecer a atenção de todos. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much, Mozambique, for that presentation on gender and climate mainstreaming in the planning and budgeting processes. Again, in the interest of time, we only have 6 or 5 minutes. Let me quickly go to the questions. Prudence, and please feel free to type questions for Mozambique. Prudence and Tobisa are already responding to some of the questions. But is Josephine still on the line? Let me call upon Josephine to pose a question on GRB and climate responsive budgeting. Josephine, over to you, please.
Oh, thank you, Daisy. My question was really because, first of all, thank you so much, South Africa, for your presentation. It was really impressive. But then I couldn't see the clear connection between the climate tagging and the gender responsive budgeting. So I wanted to know from them at what point they link the two to be able to have a comprehensive transition. Thank you. Over to you, Daisy.
Thanks. Over to South Africa, Tobisa and Prudence. I think that's a very key question. Thanks. If you can answer it so that everybody benefits from the response. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I'll start and Tobisa can add. I just want to say that because different timings of the reforms, we didn't integrate the two processes, but we do realize that there might be value in integrating them. The current approach by the Department of Women, Persons with Disability is that all sectors must have gender mainstreaming in one way or the other. So for them, it goes way beyond the climate aspect or the environment. I think because they've looked at it holistically, we will always be guided by them as the policy initiators. But we are not limited to that for our own purposes as the National Treasury, because it will serve our purpose to have the integration in terms of tagging so that you don't have to redo the process, as you'll see in the two presentations. The other one is like a trial and error process where we're seeing the gaps and we're also trying to address them through the CBT system and making sure that we have clear objectives and clear pilot processes, awareness raising, and so forth. So we are hopeful that we'll be able at some stage to ensure the integration happens. Thank you. Yes, I do think it's a very, very, very good question. Just wanted to respond to the one on South Africa is guided at 40% procurement issues for women. Is it an affirmative action? If so, what treasuries have we approached to achieve this, enable adoption by others? So for us, the challenge that we're currently facing in terms of the 40% issue is it was an announcement that was made by the president. So there is no policy or legislation to support it. So what happens then is that our Agenda for Equality Commission will be the one then would send us a request to report on progress, and so our office of our Chief Procurement Office will be able to come to get the statistics from our central supplier database and then report on it. So there are several challenges that are being realized in the implementation of this announcement. Number one is that in the central supplier database, women constitute about 20 to 30% of their suppliers. Number two, the people who then have to assess whatever action that has to happen in terms of allocation of bids or giving a tender, you have to meet all the other requirements. And then you also have to do the 40% check. And already our preferential procurement legislation favors women as it is. So we are encountering a few challenges in the implementation on this call. So I am not even able to say we can even adopt or even recommend any strategies that can be adopted by anyone else. Our presidency is already started with together with the OCPO to have sessions where they empower women who can potentially benefit from this initiative. So sometimes you have opportunities, you have an enabling environment, but the women's readiness in terms of business and being able to prepare themselves for bidding for such is also lacking. So those are some of the challenges. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prudence. Kobisa, do you want to say something, or Prudence covered it all because we don't have time?
Yes, I just want to respond to the few issues that we haven't addressed on the chat itself. There is a question from, I think, from Zolani, where he's asking whether the information after the piloting would be available. Obviously, we will, after the piloting itself, we would then have to present the findings of the pilot, and we will now then go into a process of institutionalizing the CBT across government. And there is also a plan to really create awareness more broadly, even outside of government stakeholders. So that, of course, will also be inclusive of civil society. So yes, to answer your question in short, yes, there is such a plan. And I think on just broader reflections on the issues around the CBT project and gender responsive budgeting. And Prudence, yes, correctly so. We are facing the reforms in different time zones, in different times. So while from a CBT point of view, there is already that contemplation to say from a design point of view, we already need to design the system in such a way that it can integrate and incorporate other takings. And that is also in the interest of actually mapping out the effectiveness of takings and expenditure across government. So that will also include a lens, I think, once we go through other phases, it will probably take a lens around gender. It will also take a lens around research and development. So we've had preliminary discussions about that, but we will solidify those views as we get to engage with the pilot and roll out the CBT system. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We really don't have time for climate security to jump in, but Kit was going to talk. I think we have talked a lot about sustainability and effectiveness of reforms. And just to assure you that this CABRI UNDP IID program will address these issues. And as Kobisa mentioned in her presentation, and also I think Prudence, that when you are designing, you have to be very clear. A lot of thought processes to go into what are the objectives of the reforms, then and what are the benefits that are going to be accrued, and again at the performance assessment stage. Those should be looked into. When we are assessing the performance, we should assess against the objectives that we defined, as well as the benefits, which is the effectiveness. So Kit wants to leave you with that very important point that this program will address. Again, let me thank you so much, the presenters, for this session. And my sincere apologies to the overall facilitator, Shanaz. I think we set a bad precedent for this session. I ran over my time. So my sincere apologies, Shanaz. Over to you for the next session. Sorry for that. Thanks a lot. And colleagues, please feel free to have bilaterals. Like I saw Capo Verde has a lot of questions on CBT, please can you take the contacts for South Africa and Mozambique and start communicating bilaterally? That's how we do it until the next webinar. And it might result even in South-South cooperation, and even we have done it before. We have had exchange of government delegations as a result of just one webinar. So I encourage you, colleagues, to start looking for contacts in this this group, and feel free to you don't have to go through Cabri or us. Just start talking to each other. That's the whole essence of this webinar. Shanaz, thanks a lot, and my sincere apologies. Thanks. Over to you, Shanaz.
Great. Thank you so much, Daisy, and to all the speakers for those excellent presentations. I wish we had more time for discussions, but Kit's slides, which talk about the challenges and some of the possible solutions in terms of bringing gender responsive budgeting and climate responsive budgeting in terms of expenditure tracking and bringing them together. His slides will be available with all the other slides from the two-day event. I'm now going to ask you all to please complete an evaluation survey. It will just take 5 minutes of your time. And the survey really is there for you to provide us with feedback so we can improve these sorts of events that we do for you, but we can also get feedback from you on future areas you'd like us to focus on. So I'll introduce my colleague Priya, who will facilitate that process.
Thank you so much, Shanaz. Thank you, everyone. Your feedback is very important for us. So I'm going to provide you with the links to the English evaluation form, the French evaluation form, as well as the Portuguese evaluation form. So if you could dedicate just 5 minutes of your time to fill these forms out, that would be really appreciated. There we go. So you have the links to the evaluation forms in the 3 languages. If you could just click on the link and fill it out with the language of your choice, of course. Thank you.
Excuse me, I'm not seeing the evaluation form.
Mr. Kaba, in the chat box?
Yes, okay. Right.
In the chat box, you see the link to the English form, to the French form, and to the Portuguese form. So click on the language of your choice.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, colleagues, for completing the survey. When you are done, please do take a 5-minute break. So we'll be back at 11:55, which is in 5 minutes, where we will then get straight into the next session. So welcome back, everybody. I hope you were all able to get a cup of coffee. And yeah, we're ready for the next session. So next, we're actually going to play a video for you on climate change and gender inclusive financing in Indonesia. This was actually on the program for this morning, but we had some technical difficulties. So yeah, let's watch the video, and straight after that, we will go into the panel discussion.
Indonesia is feeling the impact of climate change in many ways, especially from more frequent and destructive natural disasters such as floods, droughts, and landslides. People experience the impact of climate change differently. Poor people, particularly poor women, are more vulnerable. This is because in many cases, women face challenges to access valuable resources like land, education, and finance. These things are needed to help people adapt to changes in their lives and to respond to crises caused by climate change or other changes. Indonesia has made great strides in improving equality between women and men. There are social and structural barriers that still limit women's empowerment. These barriers need to be acknowledged and overcome. To help people in Indonesia face climate change, funding is needed for climate action. This means projects and programs that help people adapt or adjust to climate change and mitigate or reduce greenhouse gases that are causing climate change. Indonesia has several public financial mechanisms that can be used to fund climate actions. These mechanisms have existed for a while, and climate change may not be their main objective. However, they can be used to fund activities such as planting trees, building water wells, building more energy-efficient transport systems, or installing renewable energy sources. All these are climate action because they help people adapt to climate change and reduce greenhouse gases. Only since 2016 that Indonesia has started accounting for how much of the state budget is allocated for climate action. This process is called climate budget tagging. According to data from the Ministry of Finance, Indonesia spent $8.7 billion or 5.4% of the country's total budget on climate action in 2018. Now that we realize Indonesia has spent billions in climate action, it is important that it can help women and men, the rich and the poor, equally. We found, however, that the way these funds are being allocated often do not take into account that men and women, the rich and the poor, have different needs. For example, some funds may want to reduce poverty by building forestry-based businesses, but you can't loan. For example, some funds may want to reduce poverty by building forestry-based businesses. But to get loans from this fund, people need to have business skills, know about forestry, and be part of cooperatives. And even if everyone is welcome to apply, it is practically impossible for women or the rural poor to get this loan because they can't meet the requirements. Women can be powerful forces in a society if they are not seen as just victims of climate change. They are contributing every day with their knowledge and their work to make the community and households resilient to climate change. But women's actions are often silent, in the background, unseen, unheard, unpaid. Climate change is a big issue affecting everyone, and we need everyone to help face it. To do that, climate finance mechanisms need to see and hear women and men equally, and make sure they both benefit from funding the local level. Climate finance mechanisms need to be aware of these gender-related risks and limitations. Women may not be in institutions and meetings where decisions are made on how to use public funds. They may not get the information about the funds coming in and how they can access them. Even if there are women in these institutions and meetings, their views and thoughts may not be taken seriously or may not be expressed publicly due to traditions and cultures that define what women can and cannot do. Some financing mechanisms put conditions or requirements that may be much harder for women to fulfill. For example, land ownership or business skills. The belief that some decisions are much too technical for issues such as gender to be relevant. In fact, every technical decision has impact on people. For example, in projects on land rehabilitation, we often only think about which tree species grows the best, the fastest. But then, we should also think what trees bring the most benefits to women and men, and who owns the land. Who makes decisions? Who will end up working most in keeping these trees standing? Would planting these trees end up burdening people without giving them benefits? The trainings provided by local technical staff and extension services to communities about climate actions may be attended mostly by men, Trainers may use words that are incomprehensible to people, especially women, who are not used to getting such training. This means, even if there is a lot of women and men being trained, women may be less likely to understand the training. Certainly not because women are less intelligent. It is because the training is not designed to make sure everyone understands. There are some beliefs that what is good for the community is automatically good for women, but this is not always the case. There is a lack of capacity building to stakeholders at all levels on how to integrate gender and climate change adaptation and mitigation actions. What should be done? Both women and men and all other groups in a society have different but important insights and experiences to contribute to designing and implementing equitable and effective climate change actions, and they should be fully included in decision-making relating to climate change financing at all levels. CIFOR and UNDP work together to provide practical solutions and also indicators on how to implement effective, gender-responsive climate finance.
Great. Thank you so much for taking time to see that short video. Okay, without wasting much time, we're going straight into session 5. And I'm really pleased to introduce to you Margot Grenat. She is the CEO of Engine Collaborative, which works to ensure that women's empowerment, gender equality, and social justice at the core of environmental policies and projects. Margot will be moderating the panel discussion on double mainstreaming gender and climate, the way forward. She has worked closely with us in preparation for this event. Over to you, Margot.
Thanks, Shanaz. Hi, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here with you all and get to moderate this exciting discussion as the final event of this peer learning event. We've heard such an amazing range of interventions from folks with different perspectives, different engagement levels from the national to the local level, and this panel will also bring a lot of different representation from governments, international technical organizations, and also some NGOs. And so since we are running late, I'm going to kind of just dive into this very quickly and introduce our panelists, our discussants today. And make sure that everyone is online, as I can't quite see everybody, but we have joining from Côte d'Ivoire, Ms. Florence Tano, who is the Director of Gender and Equity at the Ministry of Women, Family, and Children. So welcome. We also have providing experience and insight from the Seychelles, Dr. Kai Kim Chang, who is the National Climate Finance Advisor at the Ministry of Agriculture, Climate Change and Environment in the Seychelles. And we have Dr. Mary Nayasimi joining us from Kenya, who is the Executive Director for Inclusive Climate Change Adaptation for a Sustainable Africa. And last but not least, we have Ms. Devile Mokoena, who is a gender and climate justice activist who is currently a project officer with Gender CC, an NGO based in Johannesburg, and also serves as the co-focal point to the Women and Gender constituency of the UNFCCC. So we've heard a lot of discussion around gender responsive budgeting, gender responsive climate budgeting. We know gender equality and climate change are inextricably linked, but that financing at all levels is required still to make progress on this. And we don't want this to just be piecemeal, but how to make this more systemic and systematically integrated into our national budget and public financial management systems. So it needs to be comprehensively and adequately respond to the needs and differentiated capacities and systems of our countries and communities. And this needs to be done, of course, from a gender responsive and even a gender transformative approach. And I know that there have been a lot of questions. And since we didn't have a big chance to get to them, and especially in the last session, which there was so much incredible information, and perhaps you're still left, as this is the last session, with quite a few burning questions. And so I want everyone to take maybe just a quick moment to write down in your notebook, in an open Word document, or even a quick email to yourself of what the key challenges are that you are still facing in gender responsive climate budgeting, and what are the barriers that you need to get through to be able to integrate this more comprehensively into your work. So as you think about that, we're going to get started. We have about 45 minutes for this session, so I want to ask my discussants to keep responses fairly short and concise if possible. We do have a couple rounds of question. I also really want to make sure to encourage this to be an interactive session. So as you all have done in the various sessions before, please type your questions into the chat box. We'll monitor those. And even if they're coming up as panelists are sharing, I'd be happy to have them respond as well. Dr. Nayasimi, I'm going to start off with you. Realizing that you have a breadth of knowledge on the African region, having conducted research on both policy and practice on how countries are integrating gender and climate change and this double mainstreaming in national processes. And now you're focusing on building resilience in economic sectors relevant to climate change, particularly for marginalized groups. I wondered if you could share a bit more about what this entails in your work right now with ICCASA. And how this is fostering inclusive and gender responsive processes and approaches in climate budgeting and financing. And if there are any progress and outcomes that you could share with us as well. Mary? Are you available? Shanaz, sorry, do you know if...
We'll try to find out what's happened to Mary and get her back on the line if she's dropped off.
Okay, well, then I'll just go ahead maybe with our next panelist while we wait for Dr. Nayasimi, which is Ms. Tano, who I introduced from Cote d'Ivoire. And we, are very familiar with all the different gender responsive planning and integration that has happened within national climate processes and the instruments in Cote d'Ivoire, such as conducting gender analyses to inform the National Adaptation Plan and the NDC process. And so I wondered if you could share more detail on your ministry's role in mainstreaming gender in these climate instruments and the processes, and how institutional arrangements in the country have really facilitated this interaction and integration of gender within climate planning, policy, and budgeting. So if you can unmute yourself, Ms. Tano. Yes. I cannot hear you though. Florence, are you able to hear me? I can see you. And there may be a delay for translation.
Priya, could you maybe announce in French?
Madame Tano, c'est
Oui.
Priya de Cabri. Alors, si vous cliquez sur l'icône web au bas de votre écran, d'accord? Vous voyez l'icône web au bas de votre écran?
Il faut que je me mette en plein écran alors?
Et vous mettez en français, oui, s'il vous plaît.
En
À
plein
ce
écran.
moment-là, vous allez pouvoir voir l'icône.
Oui, je vois.
Vous voyez l'icône? Parfait.
Oui.
Cliquez
La-
dessus et choisissez le français. Donc, French. C'est fait?
C'est fait? Oui.
Est-ce que vous entendez l'interprétation? Parfait. Margot, if you could please reiterate
vous entends.
your question.
Sure.
Thank you. Appreciate
Okay.
it. Thanks.
Not a problem. Okay, Ms. Tano, we know that you have been a part in Cote d'Ivoire of conducting gender analyses to inform the National Adaptation Plan and also the NDC to ensure that gender is mainstreamed within those processes. And I wanted to have you share more insight on your ministry's role in mainstreaming gender in these climate instruments and the processes, and how specifically the institutional arrangements have supported this, and what benefits you may have seen from this institutional arrangement and the support you've been able to provide to the national climate governance mechanism.
Merci beaucoup. Je suis très heureuse de partager notre expérience ivoirienne avec tous les participants de ce programme de Cabri. Alors, pour ne pas perdre du temps, je vais juste m'articuler autour de 4 points pour faire ma communication. Je vais vous raconter un peu l'historique en quelques minutes. Nous parlerons du contexte actuel et nous dirons nos réalisations, nos réussites, et nous montrerons le lien que nous avons eu à faire avec le genre et le changement climatique, et j'irai directement à ma conclusion. Voilà comment je vais articuler ma présentation. Alors, en termes d'historique, nous avons commencé à parler des questions de genre en 2000, il y a déjà plus de 21 ans. Je dirais même il y a déjà plus de 25 ans qu'on parle de genre en Côte d'Ivoire, et il fallait amener la population à comprendre que la question du genre était la prise en compte des besoins sexo-spécifiques des hommes et des femmes. Ça n'a pas du tout été facile parce qu'il y avait toujours des clivages. Quand on parle de genre en Côte d'Ivoire, il y a de cela 20 ans, les gens disaient c'est une question de femmes. Donc, il y avait un blocus au niveau d'une autre population et les questions étaient plus ou moins mal comprises. Il a fallu donc faire un travail de formation, un travail de sensibilisation sur le concept genre qui intègre les hommes et les femmes. Parce que nous avons compris à travers une étude que si nous n'intégrons pas les hommes dans la sensibilisation des questions de genre, il y aurait sûrement une incompréhension et un blocage pour pouvoir développer la transversalité du genre. Et donc, nous avons changé nos méthodes et aujourd'hui, en Côte d'Ivoire, c'est bien clair que quand on parle de genre, c'est une prise en compte des besoins sexo-spécifiques des hommes et des femmes. Ça a permis un grand apaisement au niveau des hommes et des femmes. Et le ministère de la Femme, de la Famille et de l'Enfant est très heureux de voir aujourd'hui que dans tous les ministères, les hommes parlent de genre parce qu'ils ne se sentent pas frustrés. Ce qui nous a conduit donc à installer des cellules genre en 2007 dans tous les ministères de Côte d'Ivoire. D'abord, nous avons commencé avec 14 cellules genre dans 14 ministères. Et comme la compréhension, comme je vous disais, grâce aux sensibilisations a porté ses fruits, depuis 2018, dans tous les ministères de l'État de Côte d'Ivoire, vous avez les cellules genre. Ce sont des personnels des différentes directions des ministères qui composent un pool pour travailler sur des questions de genre. Vous trouverez donc dans la cellule genre, par exemple, du ministère des Finances, je dis comme ça, Finances, vous trouvez dans cette cellule genre un personnel de la direction de planification, un personnel de la direction des ressources humaines, un personnel du courrier, pour vous dire que déjà dans chaque ministère, la cellule genre a commencé à travailler sur la transversalité, puisque la cellule genre est composée des personnels des différentes directions qui font une certaine synergie pour traiter les questions des genre. Ça, c'est l'expérience qui a vraiment réussi. Et depuis 2018, donc, quand nous avons vu ces avancées qui intègrent les hommes et les femmes dans les échanges, dans les discussions, nous sommes arrivés à l'étape où il fallait aller plus loin avec la transversalité, en regardant les questions actuelles qui sont nécessairement liées à la budgétisation sensible au genre, mais aussi liées à la question du changement climatique. Il fallait donc, après la compréhension du concept genre, passer maintenant au problème de notre temps. Et la question de la question du changement climatique a été pour nous un point culminant qu'il fallait traiter dans les cellules genre, ce qui nous a permis de mettre en place une structuration au niveau des cellules genre. Et nous avons créé ce qu'on appelle des pôles au niveau des cellules genre. Je vais vous expliquer. On a par exemple le pôle environnement. Le ministère de l'Environnement lui-même, le ministère des Eaux et Forêts, le ministère de l'Agriculture. Vous avez donc au total 5 ministères, 4 ministères, je crois, dans le pôle genre. On a aussi le pôle éducation-formation, qui regroupe les cellules genre des ministères de l'Éducation nationale, le ministère de l'Enseignement supérieur, le ministère de l'Enseignement technique. Vous avez ce pôle-là et vous avez un autre pôle genre qui regroupe les ministères de financement, comme le ministère du budget, le ministère de l'économie et des finances, le ministère du commerce, le ministère de l'industrie. Donc, en gros, nous avons fait des pôles, toujours dans la thématique de la transversalité, pour permettre à nos cellules genre d'avoir une certaine transversalité vis-à-vis du concept et surtout une grande ouverture d'esprit, bien sûr en intégrant les hommes et les femmes. C'est important pour nous. Quand nous avons réussi l'installation des pôles genre qui fonctionnent très bien, ils ont des rencontres mensuelles pour traiter des questions diverses. Et j'avoue que j'apprécie aujourd'hui, en tant que directrice genre et équité, ce grand dynamisme de nos pôles genre. Alors, ça, c'est un fait que nous avons réussi. La deuxième étape, comment traiter les questions actuelles qui prennent en compte la question du changement climatique. Et le pôle environnement est en pôle position sur cette question de changement climatique. Un partenariat donc a été noué avec le ministère de l'Environnement et le ministère de la Femme, de la Famille et de l'Enfant. Un mémorandum a été signé pour montrer très bien comment les cellules genre peuvent travailler sur les questions de changement climatique. Donc, vous comprenez que le cloisonnement des ministères est donc brisé parce que chacun avait sa chapelle. En tant que ministère des Finances, je regarde les finances, je suis coincé sur les finances. Je suis éducation nationale, je regarde mon éducation nationale, comment on va les élèves à l'école. Aujourd'hui, le ministère de la Femme, avec la direction du genre, a réussi à briser ce cloisonnement ministériel qui faisait qu'on ne voyait pas ce que l'autre fait. Et nos cellules sont vraiment en action pour briser cela. Et nous en sommes très fiers aujourd'hui. Alors, donc, ce cloisonnement ayant été brisé, le ministère de l'Environnement, qui travaille essentiellement sur les questions de changement climatique, et le ministère de la Femme en synergie ont signé un mémorandum d'accord pour dire comment on peut regarder le changement climatique, ses effets, ses impacts sur les femmes et sur les hommes. Ce mémorandum donc a été bien accepté par les deux ministères, mais aussi avec tous les ministères qui composent ce pôle genre-environnement. Des formations donc sont faites régulièrement et ça aboutit donc, je vais dire, le pôle genre, avec tous les travaux qui sont faits, la signature du mémorandum, a abouti à la révision du document de politique genre qui n'intégrait pas, il est conçu depuis 2009, le document de politique genre, il est conçu depuis 2009. Alors, si vous regardez 2009 jusqu'en 2000 maintenant, 2021, ça fait déjà longtemps, ça fait longtemps qu'il est sur la table. Et je vais dire, ce pôle genre-environnement, ces travaux ont abouti donc à reviser le document de politique genre pour permettre l'intégration des questions de genre et changement climatique. Donc, cette synergie a permis de prendre un consultant, docteur, qui aujourd'hui est en train de travailler sur l'intégration des questions de genre, changement climatique dans le document de politique, ce qui n'était pas fait il y a de cela quelques années. Il existe aussi un document de stratégie nationale genre et changement climatique de la Côte d'Ivoire. Il nous permet, ce document de stratégie nationale genre et changement climatique de la Côte d'Ivoire, nous permet donc de reviser le document général de document de politique genre. Et ça, vraiment, nous sommes très heureux en Côte d'Ivoire de voir que le genre, quand il est bien compris, quand il est bien traité, quand il permet de prendre réellement en compte la transversalité, il peut faire bouger beaucoup, il peut briser les barrières, changer les mentalités et poser les questions justes pour qu'on ait des réponses justes. Et voilà, l'une des réponses, c'est cette révision du document de politique nationale genre, qui a été impacté grâce au document de stratégie nationale genre et changement climatique de la Côte d'Ivoire. Ça, c'est un point. Donc, il y a aussi le programme national de changement climatique, qui est en partenariat avec les cellules genre de Côte d'Ivoire. Nous existons sur une plateforme qui est née et des formations perpétuelles existent qui nous permettent de comprendre la dimension de l'atténuation et de l'adaptation. Et aujourd'hui, les cellules genre sont en réflexion en ce moment pour voir comment réussir l'adaptation au changement climatique et comment réussir l'atténuation au changement climatique. Ça, c'est le deuxième point sur lequel aujourd'hui ils sont en formation, mais aussi en recherche pour trouver des solutions selon les différentes missions des ministères. Et tout dernièrement, nos réflexions étaient remontées au niveau de l'UEMOA, l'Union monétaire ouest-africaine, qui, au regard de ce qui se passe dans nos pays, est en train de, on vient de terminer une conférence là avec cette structure, est en train de nous dire passer des cellules genre aux directions. Et pour nous, c'est formidable. Les travaux donc permettent un troisième niveau. Au lieu d'avoir des cellules, il faut passer maintenant à des directions pour véritablement formaliser leurs actions et leur donner force et pouvoir d'action. Budget, surtout un budget consistant. Une direction appuie à l'institutionnalisation du genre pour que dans les budgets que les ministères du plan vont faire à partir de maintenant, la question du genre et changement climatique soit planifiée. Ça nous oblige à faire des formations pour le ministère du plan pour qu'il ait les lunettes genre, comme on dit dans notre jargon. Parce que planifier et rester aveugle genre ne permet pas de réussir la budgétisation sensible genre. Si le ministère du plan est sensible genre et qu'en leur sein, nous sommes en train d'installer une direction à l'appui à l'institutionnalisation du genre, vous comprenez que le budget va aussi être impacté positivement. Et l'existence des sous-directions vont nous permettre d'être véritablement installés dans la prise en compte du genre, mais aussi dans un traitement efficace des questions de genre et changement climatique. Et donc, en ce moment aussi, nous sommes en partenariat avec le Fonds vert, le Programme national genre et changement climatique, le ministère de la Femme, de la Famille et de l'Enfant avec la direction genre et équité que nous avons le plaisir de diriger. Nous sommes en train de travailler sur des idées de projets avec l'appui du Fonds vert pour voir comment des projets peuvent naître pour non seulement impact, on a déjà commencé l'impact en milieu professionnel, en milieu ministériel, mais comment toucher nos zones rurales. Voilà la quatrième étape que nous sommes en train d'élaborer pour voir comment on a des zones de fort changement climatique, fort impact de changement climatique dans le nord, dans le sud-ouest. Et ces zones-là, nous savons ce que les femmes vivent. Dans ces zones-là, la mer a vraiment avancé. Des villages se sont déplacés. Et pour nous, c'est rapidement que nous devons traiter ces questions de genre pour voir comment aider ces femmes avec nos projets d'appui du Fonds vert pour leur donner non seulement des moyens pour se réinstaller, mais pour se reconstruire au niveau des familles, au niveau des collectivités. Un travail aussi est en train d'être fait au niveau des collectivités, parce que les collectivités sont au centre de nos zones rurales. C'est elles qui sont vraiment les chevilles ouvrières pour le développement de nos collectivités, mais qui intègrent les zones rurales. Et ce partenariat, nous venons de le sceller jeudi dernier, jeudi 24, pour que l'impact de nos travaux touche les zones rurales. Je viens donc de vous présenter de façon schématisée, je voudrais pas que dans un discours, mais dans un schéma, comment nous voulons travailler sur les questions de genre et sur les changements climatiques. Je vous remercie. S'il y a des questions, nous restons à votre écoute. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. That was very comprehensive information about the historical process and how this has taken place. And congratulations on all of those remarkable achievements, especially quite recently as well. I think you really focused nicely on what is being done internally, those institutional arrangements that have been set up, the gender units, the gender directorates, kind of formulating this whole of government approach to support integrating gender comprehensively across the different sectors, but also then through the different tools and mechanisms, especially in the budgeting. So I want to also now have De Villiers provide some input for us, kind of transferring from that whole of government approach, but also whole of society approach, and that we need to make sure that NGOs, civil societies are a part of this process. And so, De Villiers, I wonder if you could speak to your experience engaging with local women's rights organizations, yourself as a women's right and gender equality justice advocate, on how you are working with women's groups in the communities, and especially since you're working on urban projects right now, maybe what any differentiated issues are, how to bring them in to be build their readiness to participate in these processes around budgeting, but also climate adaptation and mitigation, maybe more generally in planning as well. So to be like, over to you.
Thank you very much, Margot. And thank you for this opportunity.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, dans le processus schématisé que je viens
to share
schématisé que je viens de présenter, nous avons aussi les ONG, nous avons des organisations internationales comme CARE International, nous avons plusieurs partenaires qui nous accompagnent sur ce schéma pour passer l'adoption du genre transversal au changement climatique. Nous avons aussi en Côte d'Ivoire des fonds pour octroyer de l'argent, je vais dire certains budgets aux femmes pour qu'elles puissent monter des entreprises. Et on a deux fonds, un fonds national de financement au ministère de la Femme, de la Famille et de l'Enfant. Nous l'appelons Fonds de développement qui est adressé aux femmes. Et nous avons aussi des banques en Côte d'Ivoire, après des plaidoyers, qui ont mis en place des fonds qui permettent aussi aux femmes d'aller prendre ces fonds pour s'installer, pour monter des entreprises afin qu'on arrive un peu à cette égalité financière.
Pano, sorry, can I interrupt just to I want to make time for our other panelists to provide some input. So if we could hold off and move over to De Villiers to provide some input for a minute. De Villiers, go ahead.
Thank you, Margot. I'm I must highlight, that across the globe, we have seen a lot of women, decades ago, up to this very moment, defying injustice, challenging patriarchal norms, risking their lives for the sake of environmental justice, human and women rights. And in South Africa, we have our own 2 women who were the 2018 recipients of Goldman Environmental Prize for taking the government to court for a then proposed nuclear deal with Russia. That is Makoma Kalakala and Liz McDade. So it has been a long time that women have been at the forefront to fight women's rights when it comes to environmental and climate change issues. At local level, we have a lot of women organizations, quite formidable, organized, and are empowered to fight their cause. I remember a few years back, if I'm not mistaken, it was in 2015 when the country we had the first climate change white paper. Women, when we looked at the paper at that time, climate change to us as women organizations was something new. But people were feeling the impact at the ground, and we didn't see anything that was referencing the impacts, particularly on women, the needs of women. Then we organized ourselves, and women's group went to Parliament during the public hearing, where they were advocating for the inclusion of women's needs in that white paper policies. So women have been doing a lot to raise their voice, have their voice being heard. Even up to now, women are still challenging the integrated resource plan. They will go to the energy regulator, NESA public hearing, where they will highlight their plight when it comes to access to clean energy and affordable energy, relating the challenges they are facing locally, the type of energy that is given to the communities, whereby they have no decision to make or choose which type of energy they need as women. And also, local communities and women organizations do take part in a lot of multi-stakeholder engagements, be it at local, provincial, or at national level, to bring up their challenges. And besides engaging with government, raising their issues, they also have projects at local level that help them to adapt to the impacts of climate change and to sustain their livelihoods. We're looking at projects like agroecology, where they engage in permaculture farming practices, agro-processing, food preserving mechanisms, creating seed banks, so that in the longer, during the drought, they are able to save seeds and use them at a later stage. They also engage in social enterprise businesses, whereby they try and make energy preserving wonder bags and sell them and use them to preserve, save energy at home front, and also run workshops to teach other women and local communities on how to save energy using those wonder bags. Then, unfortunately, when it comes to the planning and budget, civil society and local organizations have never been the part of the planning process or the budgeting process. We are only considered when decisions have been taken, just to submit our comments on what has been decided already. And I think that is the core of the problem, where there is lack of inclusivity and meaningful participation by civil society and local communities. So what we're seeing is a lot of top-down approach and processes. Now, just to highlight our work as an organization when it comes to advocating for integration of gender into climate change policies, we assess the mitigation and adaptation policies. And in our assessment, we found that during the planning process, there is no consultation with local communities, civil society, and women's organization. And there is no meaningful participation even when it comes to stakeholder engagement, because in most instances, organizations have to go to where those meetings are being held, rather than having the government going to the people so that they can a meaningful participation by everyone. And also in our assessment, we found that there's still a lot of silos. Different ministries, different government departments, especially at municipal level, they still work in silos. When we were doing our assessment, interviewing key people on climate change mitigation and adaptation, once you mention gender and women, you were referred to a gender desk or women's department. And when we talk to the women's department, we find that they don't know anything about climate change decision or processes. So, which means they don't feed information into each other, they don't talk to each other. When decisions are taken, when on sustainability, on climate change, mitigation and adaptation, there's no information going to the gender and women department to put their opinion, their views, to see if there is a gender perspective or there is a gender lens on the policy itself. So yeah, there's also a lack of political will. Because I remember we were working with one municipality and the officials suggested as an organization, we can become part of their committee that is planning on climate change processes. And so that during the planning, we can be able to bring the gender perspective to the whole planning process. And her suggestion was done, because we were an external stakeholder. So decisions are taken, decisions and planning and budgets are only done with internal stakeholders. So that is a big challenge for us, because we feel that policies need to be informed, coherent and coordinated, and there also has to be an accountability and involvement of everyone. And another issue was that when we were doing our assessment, there was no availability of data, especially gender disaggregated data. So I'm happy to hear that the National Treasury is working on collating data, and it will be shared with the various departments. Now, looking at our involvement at the UNFCCC processes, as a member of the Women and Gender constituency, one of the 9 UNFCCC groups, the platform has proved to be a great tool for engagement and advocacy. It consists, the constituency itself consists of 33 women and environmental civil society organizations from across the globe. Together, we ensure that women's voices and their rights are embedded in all processes and results of the UNFCCC framework for a sustainable and just future, so that gender equality and women human rights are central to ongoing discussions. Our advocacy will consist of interventions, submissions, building relationships with party delegates and other civil society groups for a common ground, and also sharing local experiences, what is happening locally, taking the local challenges to the international platform. and also coming up with solutions. There is Agenda Just climate solution platform that has been established at the UNFCCC processes, whereby different organizations from local level are sharing what are their Agenda Just climate solutions. So, Margo, I think I will stop there for now. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much. That was a wealth of information, and especially to that last point actually flagged for me. And as we're coming to the end of this session, I thought to maybe give a plug reminder to all of the government folks that I know are online. If you recall from one of the very first presentations in the session yesterday around the international framework and the gender action plan that exists at the UNFCCC, and that one of the components of that is to have governments share their experiences, especially around gender responsive budgeting within climate change. And all of the information that has been shared by you all on what you've been doing, that is really incredible information, just like this peer learning event is sharing information across the continent of Africa, expanding that knowledge out to other places, to other countries in Asia and Latin America, also to a lot of, developed countries as well that are really grappling with how to integrate gender into climate change, is something to make sure that you get involved with your Ministry of Gender and make sure that whoever is reporting on climate change, make sure that these components are also being reported at the international level, because this is really great knowledge sharing. So we have just about 10 more minutes, and I want to give some time to have our final panelists share their experience, given how they've been involved at the Commonwealth Secretariat, but also now as a climate finance advisor. And so Dr. Kai Kim Chang, I know your connection is maybe a little weak, but I'm hoping you are online, and wanted to hear from you any lessons that you could elaborate on how you've been integrating climate and gender into the national budget system, and if there are any lessons learned from your context, and maybe specifically around a small island developing state, lessons learned for how to ensure that we can incorporate an inclusive and gender responsive climate budgeting process. So over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. So I'm just going to be turning off my video after this because of my weak connection. So let me just start by providing you with a little bit of context on how climate change budgeting has been going on in Seychelles, and how climate change is being integrated into its nationally determined contribution, and also some of the work that I'm undertaking. So under EU-funded program back in 2019, a CPEIR was conducted, which had a lot of information where it reviewed policies and institutional arrangements, and also tried to do a little bit of climate budget tagging. However, this initiative was driven mainly by the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment at that point, and the Ministry of Finance weren't fully engaged and involved in that process. So now in 2021, there is a new initiative that is undergoing, where we're trying to undertake this initiative again, but looking more and working more closely with the Ministry of Finance, working with the General Director of Budgets, trying to look at the systems that they already have in place for public financial management, and to try and use the tool that they've already developed for project and performance-based budgeting to try and integrate climate change into that system. So that's from the climate budgeting side of things. So then moving on, in relation to the National Determined Contribution, UNDP, under its Climate Promise Initiative, commissioned a report which looked into the mainstreaming of gender and youth into Seychelles NDC. And so in Seychelles NDC, which is due to be submitted today or within the next few days, or anyway this week, gender and youth considerations have been integrated into the NDC now. But also just to provide a little bit of context now on the background of gender policies and climate policies in Seychelles. So in Seychelles, within the constitution, gender doesn't really, it's so under its constitution, it guarantees equal protection before the law. So, and it says that every person, and before the law, every person is not, there's no discrimination on any grounds. And therefore, this constitution is generally seen as being gender neutral. And there is no distinction between the sectors. And therefore, gender equality and non-discrimination against women is not explicitly referred to in the Constitution. And there's a general perception that there is no discrimination against women in the public sphere, and that it's no longer prevalent in the Seychelles because of these legislative safeguards. And therefore, the official view is that from the standpoint of gender indicators, Seychelles has performed really well and made really great strides in the area of women representation. In 2011, they reported that 45% of women in decision-making was 45%. However, a report in 2019 noted that this figure had dropped 25% in 2016. So additional information is that gender representation in Seychelles at the household level, lower level management and middle management level are all female dominated, and it's only in the upper management level where it's male dominated. I also want to share that Seychelles has a national gender policy that has been recently adopted. And this includes constitutional rights, reproductive resources, climate change, as well as food and nutrition. And then moving on to the climate change policy that was adopted last year. Under the policy, there's provision for a national climate change council. And within the policy, the membership of the members for the council seeks to achieve gender parity. However, I should note that at the moment, this council has yet to be activated. So moving on, Seychelles had elections last year, and because of that, there is a new administration and there's a new minister. So under the ministry now, the Department of Agriculture has been included. So the mandate of the minister is expanded to include agriculture, climate change, and the environment. And under the Department of Climate Change and Energy, a new principal secretary has been appointed, and it's a female who's been appointed, and she is very much interested in ensuring that and working very closely with the Ministry of Finance and especially the Department of Economic Planning to ensure that economic planning in Seychelles going forward is climate resilient. And because of this discussion that is ongoing, ongoing. The ministries are, together with the Ministry of Finance, are relooking at using the existing mechanisms for the development of the national development strategies and the institutional mechanism behind that, trying to mainstream climate change into the council for the development of the national development strategies. There's therefore at the moment this question about whether gender parity will be considered in the membership of the council is under question and will need to be revised and looked into, given this new change that's only taken place in the last month or so. So just then going on to the topic specifically that we're discussing now, because the Ministry of Finance wasn't really involved in this PIR that was undertaken in 2019, I mentioned earlier that there is a new initiative going on at the moment that is being funded to track climate finance flows, especially within the energy sector. And there has also been a request from the Ministry of Finance to also include other sectors in this exercise. So we're also looking to do climate budget tagging for the agricultural sector and also activities under the environment. So I would say that actually Seychelles is only restarting and looking at the processes and trying to do climate budget targeting in Seychelles, and it's only at a very initial stage at the moment. And as the Commonwealth National Climate Finance Advisor for Seychelles, I'll be coordinating this work where we're trying to track the climate finance flows. And under my mandate, I am meant to also ensure that youth and gender is integrated into the work that I do and the projects that I coordinate. So so I just wanted to share that this is where we are at the moment. So it's an ongoing process that we'll be looking to undertake, but there are additional inclusions for women and gender and youth in the new updated national determined contributions. And we hope to use this as a platform in also rolling out the implementation, also the monitoring, reporting, and verification system for the to track the NDC commitments for Seychelles.
Great. Thank you so much. That is excellent to hear about all the progress that Seychelles has been making in integrating gender and climate change, and now, of course, into the NDC. And I think, monitoring and reporting and verification, tracking how to, develop indicators has been kind of a cross-cutting issue through the different sessions yesterday and today. And so I think that's an area that still a lot of folks are working on and trying to figure out what works best and how to develop indicators, how to track the system so that it is not just looking at beneficiaries, but that they are, transformative solutions. We don't need to just count women in meetings. There needs to be budget provided, excuse me, to support more transformative action. And so sharing that knowledge, I think, is a really great opportunity to make sure that the best solutions can be more widely taken up from different governments. We have 5 minutes, I believe, until this is bound to be wrapped up. And while I have a lot more questions and had planned to ask more questions to our panelists, I think I will just thank them for their expertise and their sharing their experiences with us as well. I don't see any questions in the chat, but if you have questions, of course, reach out to them. They are clearly doing a lot of work in this area. And with that, I will hand it back over to you, Shanaz.
Yeah. I just wanted to just say it's something that's taking place in Seychelles at the moment. So just wanted to highlight that point.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you to our expert speakers, Dr. Kai Kim. Thank you, Ndebili. Thank you, Madame Tono, for your expert insights into how gender responsive budgeting can be strengthened. So a quick reminder to please complete the evaluation survey if you haven't already done so. We've just put the link again into the chat box. And with that, I'm going to give the closing remarks on behalf of our Executive Secretary, Neil Cole, who unfortunately, due to ill health, is unable to join us today, but we are all praying for his recovery. So I will do my best to give the closing remarks on his behalf. Next slide, please. So over the last 2 days, countries have come together to discuss the opportunities to coordinate gender and climate change international planning, budgeting, and financing. We've had 16 countries participate today, which covers Anglophone, Francophone, and Lusophone Africa. We've had 82 government officials. These are from the Ministries of Finance, Budget, Environment or Climate, Gender, and Women's Affairs. I mean, what's been clear from the presentations is that countries have more experience with gender responsive budgeting. In some countries, this experience spans over 20 years and has been constantly evolving, as we've just heard from Côte d'Ivoire during the panel discussion of their 20 years of experience with gender responsive budgeting. So although experience across countries varies, we can see that gender responsive budgeting has interventions that cover the whole of the budget cycle. We heard from Liberia and Burkina Faso of how gender is integrated into their strategies and plans. We heard from Rwanda on how this is done for budget formulation. We heard from Cape Verde in the breakaway sessions of their very comprehensive gender budget tracking system. We heard from Morocco and also Cape Verde about their comprehensive reporting system in place, and also from Mozambique on how gender is evaluated in the budget. Next slide, please. Gender responsive budgeting or gender responsive climate budgeting, on the other hand, is relatively new, with many countries having plans in place to introduce reforms, such as South Africa, who presented on some future reforms they plan to introduce. So country presentations have shown that there's a solid foundation to build on in terms of gender responsive budgeting. And this experience can really inform the agenda moving forward as countries implement gender responsive climate budgeting. And there's a reason why these two go well together. Firstly, there is complementarity between the two, but also they make use of similar techniques and institutional mandates that can easily be extended to cover both gender and climate. However, moving forward, of course, gender responsive climate budgeting will probably need the same level of commitment that has been given to gender budgeting. And we've heard already of some of the challenges related to capacity in terms of the techniques data limitations, and also the need for clear political leadership. But countries are taking the steps towards gender responsive climate budgeting, and we've seen very inspirational examples of this over the last 2 days. And through the IBF-CCA program, we do hope to support ministries of finance as they integrate gender and climate change into their public financial management systems. And I particularly highlight during the implementation phase under component B, which is led by Daisy, who facilitated an earlier session, that we will be working with countries to provide, the assistance, or to support governments to integrate gender and climate into their respective reforms. Next slide, please. So the next steps, we will have a policy brief, which will basically summarize the key discussion points that have happened over the last 2 days. This will be available in the next 6 weeks and will be shared with you via email. All the session material is also available on our website. This includes the keynote papers, all the presentations, and the recordings will also be available at some point. We are planning to have a follow-on event in August this year. And it's basically to bring countries together in a smaller group to discuss one thematic area. So this will be informed by the evaluation surveys that you kindly completed. But one area or suggestion was to actually bring countries who are in the process of introducing gender and climate expenditure tracking reforms, and to see, to facilitate knowledge sharing in this area. There'll also be a third IBF-CCA the peer learning and exchange event, and this is taking place on the 14th and 15th of September. It'll focus on strengthening climate budget oversight, transparency, and accountability. They will also look at some of the country actions that have happened under component B to strengthen climate responsive budgeting. There was also a suggestion, which we welcomed from Lesotho, to have a twinning between countries which face similar contexts or have undergone a similar reform process. And it's basically where we bring countries together and we pair them up and allow them to just share knowledge between each other. Finally, on that note, I want to thank everyone for attending today. In particular, I want to thank all the presenters for the excellent presentations that you did give. I'd like to thank the facilitators for the great job you did, the program partners, IBP, IIED, and UNDP. Of course, we'd like to thank CEDA for supporting this program. We'd also like to send a thank you to some of our other partners, such as GIZ and the African Development Bank, and just to everyone who's been with us for the last 2 days and part of the discussions. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to welcoming you to the next event. So thank you, everyone, and have a lovely day further.
Thank you.
Thank you, and bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for the knowledge-based meeting. Thanks.